Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another AFAC ADAR Lessons Management webinar series. This is our second one. My name is Christine Euan, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. In this second webinar, we are very fortunate to be joined by two of Australia's most experienced independent reviewers. I speak, of course, of Mick Keelty, who was a previous former Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police, and also Euan Ferguson, who has played a number of key roles in the fire and emergency services sector, including being Chief Officer in a number of jurisdictions. I'm not going to talk any more about them because I'm going to ask them very shortly to share their insights into reviews in the emergency management sector. But right now, I would like to ask Stuart Ellis, CEO of AFAC, to provide an introduction. Stuart.
Thank you, Christine, and good morning to you all. I would like to start by acknowledging that where I'm hosting in Melbourne is this event is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today around the country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and would like to acknowledge the ongoing cultures and connections of Aboriginal people across the country. As Christine mentioned this morning, we're being joined today by Mick and Euan, two very highly respected, experienced speakers, to explore how we are going to, how we can learn lessons from reviews and inquiries. This topic is extremely relevant at the current time, with a number of jurisdictional reviews having been conducted recently and ongoing in Victoria. And of course, we await the outcomes of the National Royal Commission, with its report due on the 28th of October. It's my pleasure on behalf of AFAC and ADA to welcome you all today to the webinar, and I encourage you all to participate in the conversation and ask questions during today's session. Before taking on this role at AFAC, I consulted to the sector for 10 years and undertook more than 20 operational reviews, or participated in 20 operational reviews, some small, some significant. And more recently, I asked the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC to summarise recommendations from recent inquiries. Apart from being involved in these inquiries, which are in itself a fantastic learning opportunity, we do need to show both empathy and humility when reflecting and reviewing these operational events. In my experience, no individual willfully performs poorly, but there are always lessons we can identify and improvements that we can implement. Perhaps we can identify them ourselves, but having someone independent look over what has happened, albeit with the wisdom of hindsight, is both good practice and responsible public sector management. So we've got a great opportunity today to hear from two current reviewers, and I commend this opportunity to you. I'll now hand back to Christine to introduce our speakers and commence the event. Thank you.
And thank you. So some housekeeping just before we get started. You'll all be pleased to know that you're on mute, so if your mobile rings, fear not, you're not going to be interrupting us. The cameras have also been disabled in terms of where you are. So what this means is that in order to ask a question, you're going to have to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can then see the questions other participants have asked and add a like to any questions that resonate for you, and they will appear in the right-hand column. We ask that you use the chat function to make any comments or reflections, And if you do use the chat function, you'll need to select all panelists in order for that message to actually get out. Just having a look at these notes here. I think that part's covered. Please also note that we are recording this particular session, and an email link will be sent to you later next week with the recording link, so you can have a look at that again and share it around. Right now, I'm going to ask both of our speakers to join me and speak about their experiences of doing reviews in the emergency management sector, because, as we've just heard, they have a level of expertise that is quite considerable, and they are luminaries within their very specialised fields. So welcome to Mick and to Euan. And if I can start first with you, Euan, and a question to both of you. You've both had very specialised careers in public safety and in public service. What is it that has led you to the role of taking on this independent reviewer role, and what sustains you within it? Euan.
Thanks, Christine. And for me, taking on the role of a special inquirer or reviewer, I've done that in a number of contexts. One was when I was in the Country Fire Authority, and then also after I retired. But importantly, I've also been in a leadership organisation where I've had a review done to me, or a number of reviews done to me. And Stuart mentioned empathy and humility, and I just want to reinforce that they are two very important tools to approach an independent or an external inquiry with. Having had a number of reviews done on me and organisations that I've led has allowed me to have a particular insight. I think also, particularly since retiring, my skill set, including formal training as well as experience, has perhaps directed me down this path. And on the occasions when I've been contacted to undertake an independent review, I guess that's partly because of the expectations amongst the professional group that you're seen as someone who has a level of expertise and competence, and you're going to bring that judgment into the role of the special inquirer.
Okay, thank you for that. Mick, what are your thoughts?
I think how I've been drawn into this field has been initially into Western Australia, as many people will know, into the Perth Hills bushfire inquiries. And that was a dent of circumstance because the head of Premier and Cabinet at the time had previously been the head of Cabinet in the federal government at the time that we did the Bali bombings investigations and the Solomon Islands intervention, as well as the East Timor intervention. So I guess I was brought in less as a former police commissioner and more as a person who had been involved in crisis management. And I echo Stuart, and I wouldn't have met Stuart or Ian or Euan had it not been through this process. And you meet some terrific people, and I think Stuart's quite right. I have never met anybody who, through these reviews, has got up in the morning and said, I'm going to do something wrong today, I'm going to muck this thing up today. Everybody tries their hardest. I think the difficult thing as an independent reviewer is to maintain your independence. You are looking at things in hindsight. You are looking at it in a cool, calm, collected, air-conditioned room of an inquiry premises. You're not in the midst of the crisis where houses are burning or people are dying, and you really have to have a sense of discipline about just how critical you are. It has to be balanced with being honest. I've been fortunate enough to be drawn in, and I'm currently doing a major review for the Department of Home Affairs into a government department. I've done reviews into the Defence Force. So you have to maintain your credibility as an independent reviewer. So you have to be honest. And if people have made mistakes, it's how you couch and present those mistakes as a lesson learned for making it better for next time. And I think, to sum it up, if we're making it better for next time through these experiences and through these reviews, then I think we're putting a foot forward in the right direction.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm struck by a couple of comments that you've both made in those opening statements. Euan, you mentioned that you've had that experience of having reviews done to you. And Mick, you spoke just then about the need to maintain independence. And so it leaves me wondering about, because I believe within the sector there are a lot of people who feel that they've had the review done to them. What's your kind of approach in engaging with people that you're needing to interview in order to just make sure that they're feeling like they're not about to be done over, if I can use that phrase, and in fact are going to get a kind of fair hearing and to engage in something that is more about learning from that event. Euan, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Look, I guess the first thing is that when you take on a role like this, you will generally have a terms of reference, a well thought out terms of reference, which will be your guideline for how you pursue this particular task. I think it's very important to make it quite clear that you want to be as independent as possible. But herein lies a difficulty that Mick's had a very wide-ranging career and he's done investigations across a number of disciplines. I have a relatively smaller and narrower professional scope of expertise. So I'm very careful when I take on a role to make it quite clear about areas which may be conflicts of interest or perceptions of conflict of interest. And this often takes a number of conversations with the engaging organisation to work our way through this, because the last thing you want is to get into a process or get most of the way through a process and then all of a sudden someone raises an issue around conflict of interest. So that, as Mick has said, that issue of being seen as transparent and independent is very important. I think also just the way I approach these things is to open it up and try and be inclusive, try and be emphatic, keep on coming back to what the idea of this whole exercise, which is about identifying opportunities for better practice, a relentless pursuit of excellence. And everyone brings a different point of view to the table, and it's important to make sure that they are in an unfettered way brought to the table, and then sorted through and discussed in the course of the inquiry and who you might be listening to from various agencies who contribute.
Thank you for that. Mick, your thoughts? And I'm just noticing in kind of to continue elaborating on this issue, there's a question here that's come up that's got a couple of likes, which is really about how do you move from a reviewing investigative approach to one that might be more lessons-based and in a continuous improvement model? So Mick, following on from what Euan was just talking about, what are your thoughts about that more, dare I use the word, appreciative inquiry approach?
Look, it's not always easy. You've got to keep a few things in mind. One is, more often than not, Euan and Stuart and myself have been brought in to do these types of reviews parallel to a coronial inquiry, because more often than not, the coroner is involved, particularly if death has occurred. So first and foremost, and this was my advice to Mark Binskin before he started the Royal Commission, that he really needed to engage the coroner. And without digressing, one of the big lessons learned out of the Bali bombings was that we had to repatriate bodies to different jurisdictions in Australia. So for the first time in our history, we had to actually get collaboration beyond jurisdictions by the coroner, so they're all treating the matters exactly or in a similar way in accordance with their own jurisdictional interest. So more often than not, we're doing these inquiries parallel to another inquiry, which enables us, I think, to take a different approach. And I always start by talking to people in these inquiries, some of which have been recorded, like as in a courtroom type environment, and others less so. But I always try and explain to people that it is about lessons learned. It's not about apportioning blame, but more often, and I guess I should add to that, it becomes very obvious when you're doing one of these inquiries where something has gone wrong and people start to come and give the same story, or people give an answer to a question before you've even actually asked it because they know what went wrong. They know that they missed a piece of process or missed a piece of the standard operating procedure. I'm sure Stuart and Euan would have experienced the same as what I've experienced, and that is when something's gone wrong, it's pretty obvious to everybody. And it's not about apportioning blame, it's about actually, is the policy wrong? Is the standard operating procedure wrong? Is the equipment the wrong equipment for the type of thing that you're now being faced with or challenged by? And I think the underlying thing for me is to always remember the majority of people in these type of inquiries are volunteers. There are people who give of their own time to get involved. And I think there's a really strong need in these independent inquiries not to discourage volunteerism, because it's already, whether you're aware of it or not, I've been doing major reviews of the Murray-Darling Basin. Farmers, the next generation of farmers is not coming along, which means the next generation of volunteers is not coming along. So you need to get that balance of encouraging volunteers, maintaining the volunteer ethos, because no government, state or federal, can pay for the services of volunteers. They couldn't afford it. So we've got to keep the volunteers on side, and I think the way to do that is by a lessons learned approach rather than a who did something wrong approach.
Yep. Okay.
If I may, Christine, I think it's very easy in some respects to look at something, an operation, and to identify and apportion blame. It's actually it's an easy way out. What's more appropriate is that we recognise that we all work in a system, or we work in a whole series of systems, and that makes it quite complex. But to improve ourselves, what we've got to do is take the focus from the individuals and focus on the system. It's only through fixing the system do you then get better operational procedures and decision making, a more engaged workforce, because they know, they understand, they operate in the system. They don't want to necessarily blame the system, but it's the system where there are opportunities for improvement. Thanks.
Yeah, terrific answer from both of you there. And I think, yes, it is about, is the person in the job role the problem, or is the way the work is organised the problem? And sometimes it's that interaction between how the system operates, and some oversight within it. You've both kind of made mention of the variety of inquiries that sometimes are occurring when you're undertaking a review. And there's a question here about if 2020 is kind of known for anything, I think it's going to be the number of inquiries that are occurring currently and have. Do you think there's, what's the kind of impact of those multiple inquiries that we're currently experiencing now, these relatively unusual circumstances? Are they likely to be enhancing or hindering our opportunities for learning, do you think? Euan?
I think absolutely they will help. You know, I think it's important to note, again, coming back to the terms of reference, the state-based reviews and inquiries are just that. They're a jurisdiction, state-by-state activity. The current Royal Commission, its mandate and its focus is more on a national basis, and again looking at systems. So I think yes, there are a lot of inquiries, but it's very rare that we get so many jurisdictions who are involved in significant incidents all the way down through the East Coast and South Australia and Kangaroo Island. You know, it was a major event or series of events which has led to this, and we need to almost sort of pull on a new mindset with the effects of climate change which are occurring broadly, and it's not just about bushfire, it includes flood, includes tidal change, all those things together. We should be encouraging these sorts of inquiries. The problem is they're going to take a lot of process to deconstruct and work out what's right for our organisation and how do we take some of these recommendations and really apply them so that it comes to good actions on the ground.
Mick, do you have any observations?
No, I think just following on from what Euan said, one of the things I think that was important in this season gone by is that more often than not, and Stuart may even have a view on this, but more often than not, our seasons are characterised by a disaster in a jurisdiction. You might have several disasters over the course of a season, but rarely have we seen multiple disasters in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. And I think that's what challenged us this time round. It actually left the Commonwealth wanting in terms of how to trigger its intervention, and I'm sure the Royal Commission will look at the triggers for intervention. Where does it best value add, rather than interfere with the federated nature of our jurisdictional borders. But I think the other thing too that's really important with this is that, and when we focused on this with the South Australia inquiry, we wanted to get through that inquiry in time for the volunteers to be able to make use of it, and the government to make use of it before the next fire season. So we were hell-bent on meeting that deadline, so that actually we were trying to value add for next bushfire season. So I think if you've got that value add concept when you're doing these inquiries, it's not just about seeing what went wrong, it's about seeing what can go right for next time. And in fact, I've sort of got a mantra of what worked, what didn't work, and what do we need to change before next season. And I think if you can keep it narrow in accordance with your terms of reference, of course. The other comment I'd just make on this is you've got to remember, and I mean that respectfully, you've got to remember that oftentimes governments will use the calling of an independent inquiry as a solution to an immediate problem because of the 24/7 news cycle. What you have to do when you're looking at whether you engage yourself in one of these inquiries is look at the commitment of the government who's asking you to do it as to whether they're going to follow through with your recommendations. And I think this will also come out, and I'm sure it's come out in the work that Stuart commissioned from AFAC. We've had so many inquiries, so many recommendations, and some of them sit on the shelf and never get acted upon. I think we've got to correct that. And we've got to make sure that we don't get caught up in the political expediency of being a solution to a problem that politicians find themselves under pressure to respond to.
Very, very well said. And in particular, that trying, I guess, to have the political savvy to work out, what agendas are both on the table and perhaps below the table. There's a question here, and I'll pose it first to Mick and then back to Euan, and it's about timeframes, really, and picking up on what you were just saying about that need to make sure that there are some outcomes and some clarity around what occurred in order to move into the next fire season, for example. But at the same time, and picking up on Euan's phrase about, we work within complexes of different systems. On the one hand, there's an expectation perhaps of immediate results, immediate recommendations, yet lessons management practitioners know that frequently it takes a long time for a substantive change to actually be enacted, particularly given the complexity of those systems. So how do we actually marry up or reconcile these two sides of this particular coin? One being, the need for technical immediate expediency on the one hand, and I guess picking up on the complexity sometimes of implementation. Mick?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And one of the things that I try and do with the reports that I've written is in the recommendations, I try to get away from, an inquiry that has 122 recommendations. You might have 122 at a point in time of drafting, but then I try and reduce it to a deliverable number. The other thing I deliberately try and do with my recommendations is identify who's responsible for implementation and give them a timeline to implement by. So, for example, there is some low-hanging fruit. You're not going to, for example, procure a new fleet of vehicles between delivering an inquiry on the 30th of June and the next bushfire season. But what you might be able to deliver is other types of equipment that could be added to the, because governments are stuck with their procurement processes and the sort of governance that necessarily around those procurement processes, there's an inherent delay in any of those capital equipment items. But if you can pick up some training issues, or if you can pick up some operational issues that can have an immediate impact, that low-hanging fruit, you separate that from the strategic procurement type events. And we've got a classic here at the moment after last year's bushfire season, and that is the access and acquisition of aerial fighting resources. Given that the Northern Hemisphere has got the longer bushfire season, we've got now our longer bushfire season, and you would have all seen in the last day or two in some of the fuel reduction operations around the country, they're actually using those aerial resources. Well, we didn't do that, 3-4 years ago. So I think we just got to separate the tactical from the strategic, the short-term deliverables to the long-term changes.
Okay, thank you. Euan?
I think there's a big issue around organisational culture. We are, like it or not, we live and work, and the we includes the community. We live and work in a system which is constantly changing around us, and we need to change as well. So, the ability to have an organisational culture that is agile, able to be responsive to things that need to change really quickly and other things which change over a longer period of time, to be adaptable and adaptable in management processes as well as the people in the organisation, having a flexibility, having a changeable mindset and culture, so that we don't have organisations who are set in their ways and say, look, we've been doing this since the 1940s, so it must be right. instead of that, you have organisations that say, you know, they welcome all of this information that comes in, but they have an organisational culture and they have processes at place within the organisation that then takes all those recommendations, takes all those lessons which have been identified, gets its senior people together and says, okay, some of these might not be quite right for us. Let's adapt them so they are. And what does this mean for our organisation? Because we've got a moral responsibility to the community, to the government of the day, and also to the people in this organisation to move forward, do our grieving, make sure that we've paid respect to the systems which have gone before us, but identify the new organisation that we're going to create out of this. So for leaders of organisations, for managers, for decision makers in organisations, I think it's really important to have a discussion around what sort of culture do we support and do we try and encourage within our organisations so that when these changes need to be made, we've got a process for that and we understand why we're doing it.
Okay, that's good, Euan, in terms of talking about that issue around culture, because there are a couple of questions here that kind of mention it. One's not so much a question, but more an observation. But there's a question here about what do you do in situations where maybe the organisation isn't accepting of your findings? And you just mentioned, Euan, about sometimes the organisation itself needs to take it on board and to be saying, well, you know, that part isn't quite right. But so I guess in part there's this issue around, you know, what happens in organisations where they might not be accepting of your outcomes, your answers to what you believed happened, and to what needs to happen next. And how is it that sometimes within an organisation they might be encouraged to actually adapt it or adopt it in some way to suit what they think is their context? Euan?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Everyone will have a different context, and it may well be, you know, it's all very well for an independent reviewer or an inquirer to make a recommendation. Hopefully they've had an engagement with the organisations who might be affected by that recommendation. So there's an understanding of the context that the organisation sits in. It may well be that an organisation has got very limited financial resources. Mick talked about some of the engineering designs that come out of this. It might be for flood levees, or it might be for bushfire, or it might be earthquake or tidal zones. You don't affect those sorts of changes overnight. Within an organisation, if management are unsure why the executive or the leaders of an organisation are picking up on certain recommendations and not on others, that's a really important decision or a really important conversation that needs to go on within the organisation. I guess my final comment is that sometimes the actions of an organisation or a leader of an organisation after these inquiries, sometimes their immediate actions to adopt and move forward define the organisation and the organisational culture, and also define that leader as well. So these can be very important in the career of people who effectively are being provided with, from the outside, expert, independent views about what your future should be.
Okay, yeah, good answer. Mick, do you have any comments?
Look, I have experienced in recent years where the organisation leadership has rejected the recommendations and findings from the review to the point of being quite public about rejecting the review. When you deliver one of these reports, you're hands off then. It's up to the government of the day, the courage of that government to drive the leadership change, drive the cultural change that Euan's talking about. If the government of the day doesn't have that commitment, then you won't get the recommendations implemented. And I've seen two different approaches. I've seen one state government where under their Department of Premier and Cabinet, they set up a task force and they implemented every finding of the review that I've done. And I've seen another state where they wanted the review was done, and then they wanted to kind of bury it and get on with it because it was all too hard. And, you do get tensions between different interest groups. You may have tension between unions and non-union labour, volunteers and non-volunteers. But I think it's up to the commitment of the government of the day. You put the recommendations on the table. The one thing I will add is that there is, in my mind, a sense of vulnerability for governments if they choose not to implement your recommendations, because it then exposes them to coronial inquiries or inquests that may occur sometime in the future. And oftentimes governments, and this goes back to the Victorian Royal Commission as well, governments will be really cautious and nervous about litigation. Was it their infrastructure, for example, power poles, that caused the fire, was the cause of this event? In which case they are very cautious about how they deal with your recommendations. So there will be political reasons why some things aren't implemented. But I do think that some governments, even today, are quite vulnerable because there have been a large number of these inquiries, a large number of recommendations, and many of them haven't been implemented or seriously treated. And I'll just finish on this point on this, and that is one of the difficulties and I noticed it was one of the pre-webinar questions, one of the difficulties I think is churn. The churn of leadership, the churn of politicians, the revolving door of politicians, the revolving door of leadership in some of the organisations that are affected by these inquiries. And so the commitment to implementing the recommendations fades. And it just lies on a shelf somewhere until the next review. And the first thing I do when I'm asked to do a review is to look at the previous reviews and see what's been implemented out of them to see where the gaps are. Sorry for that very long answer, but I think that's a really important issue.
No, I agree, and I think you've provided some very good practical elaboration to understand kind of some of those issues there. While I have you, and both of you have mentioned the kind of importance of the terms of reference. So, in just thinking about how we might be able to create opportunities for learning and for improvement, what advice would you give to anyone who is developing a terms of reference for a review into the future? Mick?
I think that's a really good question, because often, I don't know about Stuart and Euan, but often the terms of reference are drafted and then you're asked to do the review. What people need to keep in mind in drafting terms of reference is they have to be deliverable. And I think in terms of number, they need to be sensible and rational in terms of the number of them. I mean, you can put down any number of terms of reference and it becomes difficult for the reviewer to address each term of reference because that's the guideline within which you're operating. And more often than not, you don't have powers. You don't have powers to subpoena witnesses or subpoena evidence. You're doing this in a very much a volunteer capacity. So people are volunteering their information, volunteering their assistance to you, apart from the West Australia ones that were done under the Public Service Commission legislation because the government of the day wanted to implement some serious changes. I think you have to be careful in drafting your terms of reference that you know what it is that you're trying to address. You know what the problems are that have emerged from the event. And more often than not, the call for an independent inquiry happens while the event's still underway, and people are writing terms of reference to get an independent reviewer in whilst we still don't know what the problems were that need addressing. And I think in short, you need to keep the terms of reference deliverable. You need to keep them more or less accountable, and I think you need to keep them succinct so they're actually delivering or answering the problem that you're trying to resolve or the thing that you think went wrong.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that. Euan, your experience?
Yeah, look, I agree with Mick, and certainly agree. When a terms of reference is written, it almost needs to be written and then put it in a cupboard for a day and then come back to it and reread it and say, well, what would a reviewer actually do with these terms of reference? It's always a worry when you read the terms of reference and you think, they overlap, they chop and they change. It's not really clear what it is the government or whoever issues the terms of reference is trying to get at. So it's got to be really crystal clear. Each terms of reference will be informed by the events which occurred and often those events and the need for an independent reviewer becomes self-evident. The significance of the terms of reference is that will also shape the end report as well. So, one of the options a reviewer has is to report according to each of the terms of reference. It's a really good way of, acquitting each of those things. So again, it just reinforces the importance of that, and hopefully the government take a little bit of advice from trusted people outside of the government when they're formulating these terms of reference.
Okay. Yep. Good. Yeah, an important point, I think. And it gets to, there's a kind of observation made with a bit of a question here, again, about, I guess, the politicisation of reviews, and, you've already spoken about the litigious aspects. So how do we kind of balance the need for a legal approach with one that's actually able to skirt around or get through some of those media political pressures in order to get a better balance on the learning aspects, the learning outcomes? Euan?
Well, I think one has to be very conscious of conversations which are going on, around the inquiry, and it's not uncommon for Parliament to debate these things, although hopefully our elected representatives have confidence in the system that they'll let the process run. Again, I think there will be commentary in the media. It's really important to allow the inquiry to run its course. I know, and Mick would have an interesting take on this, often when there's an inquiry that the media will show intense interest and in some cases want to have a day-by-day report on what occurs. That then leads to another question, and I'm sort of going off your question a little bit here, Christine. In the conduct of the review, as a reviewer, do you seek to have public hearings? Do you seek to have submissions? How do you deal with those submissions? Are they public themselves? Are you going to interview witnesses? Is that an open interview? Is it a closed interview? These are a number of things which need to be considered very early in the piece so that those processes themselves will determine how wide the conversation occurs. So if I think back to an inquiry I did in WA 3 or 4 years ago, we discussed at length whether we wanted to have open interviews and basically in a public court, or whether they'd be closed interviews. We discussed at length whether we published submissions. In the end, if you made a submission, you got a little note back saying, are you comfortable with this being made public? And they were all made public, but it's a really important issue in the construct of the review and the inquiry as to how public you want to go to engage with external players.
Okay, thank you. Mick, any other comments, particularly around how you might assist in a review to navigate around some of the legal aspects in order to get to an organisational level response and a lesson for at an organisational level without causing prejudice to those outcomes of other reviews, for example?
Yeah, look, it's I agree with everything that Euan said, and he's touched on some very important points, and they're worthwhile repeating in one sense. I mean, that whole issue of whether you have public or private hearings is really critical, because if you have public hearings, then the media is entitled to be there. Other members of the community are entitled to be there. So your approach is perhaps slightly different because of the public nature of it. And the people coming to see you, their approach might be different as well, because they may see issues that they don't want to put on the table because they see them being either as political or as being contrary to the way they've developed their teamship within their volunteer group or whatever it might be. Look, the other thing I think that's really important here is that when you call for submissions, and one of the reasons why people like Euan and Stuart and myself and others are asked to do these independent inquiries is because government want the thing to happen and happen relatively quickly. They don't want it to be bogged down in, and I don't want to be disrespectful or disparaging, but in a lawyer's picnic where you've got the lawyers representing the state, the lawyers representing the unions, the lawyers representing key stakeholders, all sitting at a bar table, all being paid a substantial amount of money, whilst you've got a team of people. The bigger the inquiry, the bigger the team. If you do get submissions, they have to be read, and you have to come to a decision on them. Some of them are unwanted submissions, if I can put it that way. There is a body or there are groups of interest, there are interest groups in the community whose profession it is about sending submissions to these inquiries, otherwise they look. You end up with a 150-page submission, most of which isn't relevant to your terms of reference, but you still have to deal with it. I think what Euan is saying is really important, and that is once you're engaged as an independent reviewer, I love what Euan says. Put the terms of reference in a cupboard and then bring them out the next day. I think also sit down with whoever it is you're appointing as an independent reviewer and talk through just what's the best way of doing this, because there's a balance. If you do it like I did the West Australian review under the auspice of the Public Service Commission Act, then you have powers and you also have consequences for people who maybe don't tell the truth or maybe don't cooperate fully with the inquiry. Plus you have access to every government record that you want. Whereas if when doing, say, the Bega Valley bushfire review or in the South Australian bushfire review, I did it in a cooperative way rather than a legislative way. And I think governments know that they can get the same outcome by appointing people like Stuart and Euan to do an independent inquiry. They'll get the outcome. It doesn't cost an arm and a leg, and actually gets to the point at the nub of the problem. And I think that's really important in terms of how you conduct the inquiry. Needs to reflect the desire that government wants in terms of an outcome. Not that you're getting the outcome that they want, but the outcome in terms of how the inquiry should run or should be run, and the independence of that inquiry has to be maintained in the same way as the independence of the judiciary, but without all the bells and whistles attached to it.
Okay, yeah, interesting nuance here, I think, in terms of the various considerations that are important in undertaking reviews. Mick, while you're on the floor, do you think how's the appetite these days for undertaking reviews? Are we kind of getting better at it? Or are people kind of starting to shy away from them?
I think it comes down to what it is you're reviewing, and whether it's achievable, whether you're value-adding. For me personally, it's whether I'm value-adding. I'm often asked to do things, from police pursuits where death has resulted in the police pursuit, right through to review of the Defence Force after the Bataclan attack. I think for me personally is, if I think I've got the skills, I'll do it, and if I think I'm value-adding, I'll do it. But if it's something outside my profession or outside my experience, then I have a network of people who I can refer to. I think the trend of this sort of independent interview, has been less bureaucratic, so it's attractive in that sense, and it gets the result. And I think it's attractive in that sense, which is why I think people like us who are asked to do these reviews have to maintain our credibility and our integrity, because otherwise, we will bring down the whole nature of independent reviews.
Okay, thank you. Euan?
Yeah, look, I think there will always be an appetite for these sorts of reviews, and I think there'll be more people wanting to do them than is actually the case. I think it is important that some people are appointed to the review panel because they're an academic and they've got a research or an academic bent in this particular area. Some of them have a legal background. Some of them have been a senior person in a government organisation, and you'd probably put Mick and Euan and probably Stuart into that as well. Or it might also be someone who has relevant industry experience. One needs to be careful that doesn't set up a bias, but it can be a tremendous learning and development opportunity to take someone out of an organisation, assign them even as a research type staffer to a review team to just see how it all works, and to be an industry expert who the other members of the review team can go to and trust that the feedback that they have. So in terms of the appetite for undertaking reviews, I think there still is an appetite. I think it's important to have a broad-based skill set as possible, and as much as possible try and be inclusive, as I've said before, of their particular point of view. So, some of the legal background will have a quite different point of view, perhaps to an academic. And so we need to draw those points of view out and evaluate them as part of the review process.
Are there particular recurring themes that you both see kind of coming up time and time again, despite the fact that, we seem to be getting better and learning some of the processes that help us to get toward learning lessons and organisational change? Are there some lessons that kind of fall into more of a Groundhog Day, finding it, they're just continuing to be coming up because they haven't yet been changed or learnt? Euan?
Judge Stretton, in his 1939 bushfire review, it's a wonderful bit of work. I'd encourage anyone who can access the report to read it. One of his recommendations was that there be a school-based education around bushfire protection and resilience. There are many, many reviews subsequent to Judge Stretton's review which have recommended the same thing. So I find that education, leading the community down a path to taking action, is something which is a recurring theme. And just as an aside, last night there was an article on ABC about severe weather, and they were going and knocking on doors in the bushfire context as to well prepared you were, and it was really good because my sense is that the majority of members of the public, they hear all this noise, but they don't convert that into action. So the recurring theme that I see is this of education and action in the community. Linked to that is a greater emphasis on, stop building houses where they're going to be washed away by a high tidal effect or a flood or a bushfire or an earthquake. We're smarter than that. We need to not only have these standards, but we need to implement these standards.
Thank you. And in the final 30 seconds for answer, Mick, what would you suggest?
Look, the recurring themes for me have been the absence of implementation of previous reviews. That has come up in every bushfire review I've done, or every emergency management review I've done. I think Euan's last point is an extremely important point. The recurring theme for me is retrospectivity. You can't retrospectively go back and not build in the places where local governments allow people to build. And that has been a recurring theme right from day one for me. And I think too, the final one that I would point to is there are Australian standards. There are standard operating procedures. So there is an audit trail of the performance against a criteria. And I think if the criteria is wrong, then people have been very slow to change the criteria. It's either that or they haven't acted in accordance with the standard. And that's been a recurring theme. The standard isn't wrong, it's that people have drifted away from that standard.
You still haven't learnt that aspect,
So in developing leaders and developing practices, if the standards are wrong, change the standard. Otherwise, keep training your people to the standard so they know when a reviewer comes in that the reviewer will measure performance against the standard.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to draw this particular webinar to a close now. It's about all we have time for. Unfortunately, I think it's been an excellent conversation. And on behalf of AFAC and ADAR and everyone else for attending today, and I'd like to thank our speakers, Euan and Mick, for sharing their expertise, knowledge and their time. Following the webinar, you'll be mailed a link to the online evaluation. Please complete that. We look forward to your feedback. It's been a pleasure to be your host today. Hope you've gained some useful insights, and thank you very much for attending, and wherever you are, stay safe. Thank you.